The abduction. You think you're safe in your own home? Think again. Hit subscribe, drop a comment, and don't blink. Because what happened next turned America's most privileged heiress into a criminal on the FBI's most wanted list. February 4th, 1974. It was a cold, quiet night in Berkeley, California. The streets were empty except for the hum of passing cars and the distant sound of a police siren. Inside a small apartment near the University of California campus, 19-year-old Patricia Campbell Hearst, granddaughter of media tycoon William Randolph Hearst, was preparing to have dinner with her fiancé, Stephen Weed. The air was peaceful, routine. But within minutes, that calm would be shattered forever. At 9:17 p.m., there was a knock at the door. Stephen called out, thinking it was a neighbor or delivery. Instead, the door burst open. 3 armed figures in military jackets stormed inside. "Freeze!" one shouted. Another grabbed Patty by the wrist. Before she could scream, a cloth bag was shoved over her head. Neighbors heard the chaos, the shouts, the sound of struggle, the crash of furniture. One witness saw a small white car speeding away, tires screeching as it vanished into the night. Within hours, police were on the scene. Broken glass, a missing heiress, no ransom note, no suspects. Just one phrase left behind, spray painted in red on the wall outside the apartment. "Death to the fascist insect that preys upon the life of the people." Detectives stared at the words, confused. It wasn't the mark of a ransom kidnapping. It was something else, something political. By morning, the news broke nationwide. Heiress Patty Hearst abducted from Berkeley home. The country was stunned. The Hearst family was one of America's most powerful dynasties, owners of newspapers, TV stations, and magazines. Now, one of their own had vanished without a trace. The FBI released the footage, naming her an active participant in the robbery. Overnight, Patty Hearst went from victim to fugitive. News anchors replayed the tape again and again. Talk shows debated what had happened to her mind. Psychologists argued about Stockholm Syndrome, a term still new at the time, when hostages begin to identify with their captors. But inside law enforcement, there was no time for debate. A manhunt was underway. Agents raided suspected SLA safe houses across California. In one, they found propaganda materials, manifestos, photos, and diagrams of banks and government buildings. The SLA's goal wasn't ransom, it was revolution. And Patty, now calling herself Tanya, had become their public symbol. A month later, the SLA struck again. Another robbery, another tape. Patty's voice was stronger this time, her words clearer. "I have chosen to fight alongside my comrades. I'm not a hostage. I am a soldier of the people." Her parents were crushed. The public was split. Half saw her as a victim, the other half as a traitor. As the investigation continued, detectives uncovered that the SLA had moved from one safe house to another, always a step ahead. One lead led to Los Angeles, where authorities surrounded a small suburban home. At dawn, police megaphones echoed through the street. "Symbionese Liberation Army, come out with your hands up." Moments later, gunfire erupted. A massive standoff unfolded, broadcast live across the nation. When it ended, the house was engulfed in flames. 6 members of the SLA were dead, but Patty Hearst was not among them. For the next year, she vanished, a ghost within her own country. Her face was everywhere, on FBI posters, in newspapers, on television. Wanted for bank robbery. Every sighting turned into a false lead. Some claimed to have seen her in San Diego, others in New York. Each time, The brainwashing, September 1975, a year and a half after her disappearance. The FBI's most wanted heiress was finally in custody. But when agents led Patty Hearst through the doors of the federal building in San Francisco, they didn't see the frightened girl who'd vanished in 1974. They saw someone new. Gone was the soft-spoken college student. In her place stood a woman with cropped hair, a steady stare, and a voice that didn't tremble. When asked if she had anything to say, she simply replied, "I was a soldier. I did what I had to do. To law enforcement, it sounded like defiance. To psychologists, it sounded like a mind transformed. But what happened between the night of her kidnapping and this moment remained a mystery, until she started talking. In the months following her arrest, FBI agents and prosecutors began piecing together her story through interviews, tapes, and testimony. What emerged was both fascinating and disturbing, a journey into isolation, fear, and control. Patty described being locked in a dark closet for weeks after her abduction. She said she was blindfolded, tied up, and constantly lectured by members of the Symbionese Liberation Army, or SLA, about politics, injustice, and revolution. They told her she was privileged, that her family represented the oppression of the poor, that she could earn her freedom by joining their cause. At first, she resisted. She screamed, begged, argued. But over time, something in her began to crack. She said she was deprived of sleep, bombarded with propaganda, and isolated from all sense of normal life. The group's leader, Donald DeFries, known as General Field Marshal Cinque, became her primary contact. He preached that America was corrupt and that violence was the only path to change. Slowly, her reality began to shift. When she was finally allowed out of the closet, she wasn't greeted with kindness. She was given a choice: join the SLA or die. According to her later statements, she chose survival. By the time the famous bank robbery took place in April 1974, Patty was unrecognizable to those who knew her. Surveillance footage showed her holding a rifle and shouting orders alongside her captors. But the images didn't tell the whole story. She claimed that, at the time, she believed the police would kill her if she surrendered. She said she had been convinced that she was already marked as an enemy of the state, that the only safety left was inside the very group that had kidnapped her. Psychologists would later describe it as a textbook example of coercive persuasion, a mix of trauma, fear, and psychological manipulation that breaks down the will and replaces it with dependence. But prosecutors saw it differently. They called it choice. As her trial approached, the country was split. On one side were those who saw her as a victim, a young woman trapped by a group that exploited her fear and identity. On the other were those who saw privilege, an heiress who had committed armed robbery and now wanted to escape responsibility. Television networks replayed the bank footage daily. Newspapers published leaked details of her confessions. Editorials asked, "Can terror really change who we are?" It wasn't just a legal case anymore. It was a psychological puzzle, a media war, and a cultural reckoning. Even her parents didn't fully know what to believe. Her father, Randolph Hearst, stood outside the courthouse and told reporters, "My daughter is a victim. She's been brainwashed." But others whispered that the Hearst family's influence might sway justice. Inside the courtroom, the defense team built their case around a controversial idea: that Patty Hearst had been programmed. Her lawyer, F. Lee Bailey, argued that she'd undergone a complete psychological transformation under captivity. He brought in psychiatrists who described coercive persuasion, thought reform, and survival conditioning. To illustrate the power of control, they pointed to military studies on prisoners of war and cult indoctrination. The message was clear. Her actions weren't rebellion. They were survival. But the prosecution countered with evidence that painted a different picture. They showed letters Patty wrote to the SLA leader, affectionate, loyal, even admiring. They played recordings where she sounded confident, committed, and in control. In one, she said, "I have chosen to stay and fight. I am not a victim." Those words echoed through the courtroom like a confession. Reporters swarmed outside daily, broadcasting every twist. Late-night talk shows debated whether she was a victim of the system or a symbol of it. To some, she was America's lost daughter. To others, she was proof that anyone, no matter how wealthy, could fall into extremism. As her lawyers fought to explain her transformation, Patty herself sat still, often emotionless. Some said she was detached. Others said she was simply exhausted. When she finally took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She spoke softly but firmly, describing her captivity and the psychological pressure she endured. She said she believed that compliance was the only way to survive. "After a while," she said, "you stop knowing where their thoughts end and yours begin." Her words were haunting and unforgettable. The media dubbed it the trial of the mind. Psychologists on TV debated whether a person could truly be brainwashed. Some believed Patty's trauma had rewired her responses, that her loyalty to the SLA was manufactured through fear. Others argued she had internalized the ideology and made her own choices. The lines between victim and accomplice blurred with every testimony. Then came a revelation that turned the case again. Hidden tapes recovered from an SLA hideout. One contained Patty's voice after the robbery, a calm, almost casual. She spoke about the revolution, calling the experience liberating. The prosecution seized on it. "This isn't the voice of a hostage," one lawyer said. "This is the voice of a believer." Her defense team countered that she had been conditioned to sound that way, that trauma can make people echo their captors' beliefs as a survival mechanism. The jury was torn, and so was the nation. Outside the courtroom, protests erupted. Students waved signs reading, "Free Patty," while others held banners demanding justice for the victims of the SLA's crimes. Television cameras captured both sides, their chants blending into chaos. Inside, Patty's lawyers made their final plea. She didn't choose this life. It was forced upon her, shaped by fear and manipulation. The prosecution stood and delivered their closing argument. She wasn't a victim, they said. She was a participant, and her choices, however influenced, had consequences. The courtroom sat in silence. The air was heavy with uncertainty, as if no verdict could ever truly define what happened. On March 20th, 1976, the jury returned. After 57 hours of deliberation, the foreman rose. "We find the defendant, Patricia Campbell Hearst, guilty of bank robbery." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Her parents held each other. Reporters rushed for the doors. Patty sat still, blinking slowly, showing no reaction. As she was led away, a reporter shouted, "Do you still believe in the SLA?" She looked straight ahead and whispered, "I believe in freedom." She was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. But even as the doors closed behind her, the debate raged on. Had she been broken, reshaped, and used as a weapon? Or had she found power in rebellion and chosen her own path? The truth, it seemed, lived somewhere in between. Because while the world saw her as either a victim or a villain, the one person who truly knew what happened inside that closet, what she saw, what she felt, what she feared, was Patty Hearst herself, would change everything. The verdict and the pardon. September 1975. When the courtroom doors closed behind Patty Hearst, it seemed like the end of a saga that had consumed America for over 2 years. But in reality, it was only the beginning of a battle. Not for freedom, but for redemption. At first, prison life was quiet. She followed rules, stayed out of trouble, and avoided the spotlight. But even inside, her name carried power. Guards whispered, inmates stared, and newspapers ran weekly updates on her behavior. Outside those walls, her story kept dividing the nation. Was she a criminal or a victim? A rebel or a casualty of manipulation? Psychologists, journalists, and talk show hosts all had theories, but no one had answers. Then something unexpected happened. Her case caught the attention of a man who believed she'd been wronged. A young lawyer named William Kunstler, famous for defending political radicals. He claimed her trial had ignored the key issue: coercion. According to him, Patty hadn't been free to choose anything. When your entire world is controlled by fear, he said, your choices stop being your own. Kunstler's involvement reignited public interest. Documentaries, interviews, and think pieces flooded the media. Once again, the name Patty Hearst filled headlines. But this time, the tone was shifting. People began to question the fairness of her sentence. Had she been punished for her crimes, or for being a symbol of everything America feared in the 1970s? Revolution, wealth, and youth rebellion. Then, in 1977, something even more unexpected happened. A visit from an unlikely ally, President Jimmy Carter's administration. The Hearst family had quietly petitioned for clemency, supported by psychiatrists and human rights advocates. They argued that Patty's case represented an extreme form of trauma response, not criminal intent. After months of review, Carter agreed to commute her sentence. Instead of 7 years, she served just 22 months. When she walked out of prison in February 1979, cameras flashed once more. But this time her face was calm, emotionless, unreadable. She didn't speak to the press. She simply said, "I want to live my life quietly now." But America wasn't done talking about her. In the years that followed, Patty tried to rebuild. She studied art, moved states, and kept her distance from her family's media empire. But the shadow of the Symbionese Liberation Army followed her everywhere. Movies were made about her life, books analyzed her mind, and professors debated her case in classrooms. The words brainwashing, Stockholm Syndrome, and psychological coercion became part of the American vocabulary because of her story. But what most people didn't know was that Patty had begun quietly helping the FBI identify former SLA members. Her cooperation led to several arrests and the closure of long-dormant cases. Some saw it as redemption. Others called it survival. Then, in 2001, more than 2 decades after her release, came the final twist. A presidential pardon, signed by Bill Clinton during his last days in office. It erased her criminal record, officially closing the book on one of the strangest cases in modern American history. The pardon shocked many. Critics argued it was a political favor to the Hearst family. Supporters said it was justice delayed, but finally served. For Patty, it was peace, or something close to it. But the deeper question never went away. Was she ever truly free? Experts revisited her tapes and statements, analyzing every word, every tone. Some argued she'd regained control early on, but chose to stay. Others insisted the trauma had rewired her thinking beyond recognition. The truth, as always, sat in the gray area between guilt and survival. In late-R interviews, Patty herself avoided labels. She said she didn't like being called a victim, but she also didn't deny that the experience had changed her forever. "I survived something," she once said, "and that's enough." She married one of her former bodyguards, had children, and slowly disappeared from public life. For decades now, she's lived quietly. No interviews, no books, no speeches. Her silence became its own kind of statement. Looking back, her story became more than a criminal case. It became a mirror for a decade defined by chaos. The 1970s were full of contradictions. Peace protests and bombings, freedom and fear, rebellion and conformity. Patty Hearst's story captured it all. A young woman torn between two worlds, manipulated by both, and forever trapped in the middle. And though time has passed, her name still evokes the same question every generation asks anew. What would you do if survival meant becoming someone you no longer recognized? Today, Patty Hearst is a grandmother. Her mugshot still appears in history documentaries, her voice in true crime podcasts. But behind every headline and theory lies a human truth. That the line between victim and accomplice can sometimes vanish under enough pressure. Her life, in the end, wasn't just about crime or punishment. It was about identity, about how fear, persuasion, and circumstance can twist even the strongest sense of self. They called it the crime of the century, but maybe it was something even more unsettling, proof that the human mind, under enough darkness, can forget who it truly is. If you think this story was shocking, wait until you hear the next one. Subscribe, because the truth always has another side.